Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and currently I serve on the MS Society's Community Review of MS Research Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. MS Navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. When you're living with MS, traveling can sometimes feel like a huge undertaking. And air travel in particular can get really complicated. We're heading into the summer vacation season, so the timing couldn't be better to talk with Dr. Scott Crawford. Dr. Crawford lives with MS, and he has extensive experience as a passenger on commercial airlines. He's joining us today to share his experiences with air travel, both the challenges and solutions. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about the MS Society's current advocacy efforts to make air travel safer and more inclusive for everyone who's living with MS and everyone with other health conditions as well. Dr. Crawford holds a PhD in clinical psychology with a subspecialty in neuropsychology from the University of Southern Mississippi. He joined the MS Society to advocate for issues that are important to people living with MS on both the state and federal levels. Dr. Crawford is a member of the Society's Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi Board of Trustees, and he's a district activist leader. Welcome, Dr. Crawford. Thanks for being with us today.
It's great to be here, John. Thank you.
Well, why don't we start at the beginning of every trip? Let's talk about getting to the airport. Where have you found success when it comes to affordable transportation, parking, and unloading?
I live in Jackson, Mississippi, the capital and largest city in Mississippi. The broader metro area here has about 250,000 people, so that's a medium-sized city. But our public transit system here doesn't serve the airport. Moreover, we don't have any wheelchair accessible taxis or ride-hailing services here in the metro region. So we advocated with the Jackson Municipal Airport Authority to hire a contractor who can and now will provide wheelchair accessible service to and from the airport at all hours that flights are leaving or arriving. So that's been very helpful. That's been a success.
Okay, well, let's assume we've arrived at the airport. Let's talk about the next potentially challenging situation. I'm wondering whether you've experienced any obstacles getting through the TSA checkpoint and onto your gate. And if you have, I hope you'll share those strategies that could improve someone else's experience getting through TSA.
Right. It depends on whether you use a wheelchair like myself, and if you take your own wheelchair with you. If you are ambulatory, you can go through the metal detectors like ambulatory people do. If you brought your own wheelchair, you will likely get routed around the metal detectors and or scanning devices, and you'll have to go through a pat-down screening. But I strongly recommend that you get the TSA pre-check certification. It's a little over $70 now, but it is definitely worth it because it minimizes the screening process and streamlines it so that you can get through with a minimum of hassles. But the one thing I would say to everyone going through the TSA screening, ask for the assistance that you need. And you can go to the TSA Cares website and ask for assistance in advance. Strongly urge you to do that, but you'll still have to self-identify once you get to the checkpoint as the person who asked for reasonable accommodations. So be assertive, let them know what you need, and proceed from there.
We heard from Lolita. Lolita tells us that she has her first solo trip planned, and she's worried about managing her luggage. Are there any services that Lolita can schedule ahead of time to assist her with luggage?
Yes. By all means, contact your airline well in advance, either by phone, they'll have a phone number, or via an online form, and request for all the assistance you'll need. You have the right to curbside assistance from the time you get out of your vehicle all the way to your gate. So if you need that assistance, by all means, ask for it because you're entitled to it. They just need to know in advance.
Amanda told us that she worries about her mobility device being damaged in the plane's cargo hold. What can Amanda do to protect herself and her property?
In the past, I made a laminated card showing in photos and in written language how to configure my chair so that it would get into the cargo hold. It's a good idea to have that attached to your chair. But just to be sure, and this is what I do now, ask to speak with the ground crew chief so you can personally guide and show them how to stow your wheelchair so that it will go into the cargo hold without any problems.
That is a great suggestion. We heard from Rick. Rick says he feels anxious about boarding and deplaning using that aisle chair. Based on your experience, what suggestions do you have for Rick?
Yes, be aware that those aisle chairs are very narrow. They're only about a foot wide. If you're able to stand on your own and pivot to the aisle chair, then great. If not, bring whatever you use at home to help you do a side-to-side transfer from your wheelchair to the aisle chair. Now, you also need to let the people know who are transporting you in this aisle chair if you have any sensitive areas or if you have any hyperreflexivity, because those aisle chairs are not very maneuverable, and it's possible you could hit your knee or your shoulder on one of the seats as they pivot from first class to coach.
Well, now that we've made it onto our flight, let's consider what happens once the plane is taken off. We've heard from Cheryl, and she's concerned about needing to use the restroom once the plane is in the air. As a person with MS who's going to be without their mobility device during the flight, what can Cheryl expect?
Here's the problem. Only wide-bodied or two-aisled aircraft are required to have an in-flight aisle chair, and most domestic flights are not wide-bodied aircraft. So if you're able to walk a few feet, ask for a seat near the lavatory and do the best you can. Many people living with MS have problems with bowel and bladder, so I recommend wearing an incontinence undergarment. That's what I do when I fly.
Now our plane has landed. Can you walk us through the deplaning process and share anything that a person living with MS should consider if they have a connecting flight?
Sure. One thing you'll need to be very careful of is as you make your reservations, be sure that any connecting layovers are at least 2 hours in length. Don't allow it to give you a shorter turnaround time, because as a person with a disability using an aisle chair, you'll be the last person to be deplaned. Everyone else will have left the plane. And sometimes the airlines are delayed in getting the staff to get you off the plane. I've had it take up to 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes to deplane. So you definitely want to have a 2-hour layover so that you don't miss a connection. So that's very, very important.
Jamal says that he uses a mobility device and he's been asked to check it to his final destination. What other options are available so that Jamal can maintain some independence while he's making that connection?
Yeah, I strongly urge everyone who travels with their own personal wheelchair or scooter to ask to have it brought to them as they exit the plane after every leg. The ACAA, the Air Carrier Access Act, requires that much, but only if you request it. Why? Because it'll allow you to maintain your independence between connections. And it will also allow you to inspect your chair or mobility device for damage. That'll matter later because you will, if it is damaged, you need to know on what leg it was damaged, what trip.
I heard you mention a few times that someone has the right to request certain types of assistance. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the Airline Transportation Bill of Rights is and how a person living with MS can best use that information to their advantage.
Yeah, less recently, the FAA published the Airline Transportation Bill of Rights, and it is a very concise, easy to use, easy to read guide that goes over all of your rights and responsibilities as a person with a disability as you fly. You don't have to memorize it. Don't worry, but do download it to your phone or your tablet and have read over it so that you're familiar with what to expect and what you're entitled to.
The National MS Society is supporting legislation that will make air travel easier and more inclusive for everyone. In fact, you and I were both recently in Washington, D.C. to advocate for the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. How do you think that bill will impact air travel for people living with MS?
It would change everything for the better. So I urge you to get involved. Basically, after technical obstacles are overcome, the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, known as H.R. 1267 or Senate Bill 545, will require new aircraft as they're built to accommodate securing people in their personal mobility devices like they are on trains and buses and taxis and vans. We want to get the ACAA put into the FAA reauthorization, which would make air travel safer for people of all abilities. So act now.
It's always struck me as odd that as a society, we've recognized the need to make accommodation, as you've said, in taxi cabs, in buses, and trains. Somehow, airplanes got overlooked or for whatever reason left out. But I'm certainly glad to see this is the kind of legislation that's really going to make them accommodate everyone on an airline. We won't have to worry about those aisle chairs anymore. We heard from Claire. She tells us that she has MS, but she doesn't use a mobility device. And Claire wants to know how this bill might improve her air travel experience.
Well, Claire may not use a device now, but we should be aware that 1 in 3 individuals living with MS eventually do use a mobility device. So keep that in mind. But even so, the ACAAA, the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, would require broad accessibility standards that would impact all people with disabilities. It would also improve DOT enforcement, Department of Transportation enforcement, and grant a private right of action so there would be greater accountability if and when things go wrong.
George contacted us reminding us that legislative bills take a long time to become law. Can you update us on where this bill is at in the legislative process?
Sure. We're working on getting the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act added into the FAA reauthorization, which is currently being written in Congress. The current authorization expires at the end of September, so the time to act is right now. We need everyone's voice to urge Congress to include those provisions in the FAA reauthorization. So act now.
And in a moment, we're going to help people understand exactly how they can do it and how easy it is to act now. But you've shared some great information with us today, Dr. Crawford. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our viewers to remember?
Sure. The first one, be absolutely certain to contact your airline in advance and convey any special needs you may have, such as needing curbside assistance with your luggage, bringing your own custom wheelchair, wanting it brought to you at each connection, if you'll need an aisle chair to get to your seat, any particular seating concerns you have. For instance, do you need an aisle seat? Do you need a window seat? Do you need a seat near the lavatory? Any special accommodations for seating must be made in advance. So, and any assistance you might need making a connection. So, in case you are experiencing cognitive fatigue in making a connection, you can ask for an assistant to guide you from one gate to the next. So the second thing is, we've already mentioned, download the Air Carrier Bill of Rights. Have that on your phone or your tablet and read it over before the flight, just so that you know what to do when things go wrong. The third thing, and the most important one, if you believe your rights are being violated under the Air Carrier Access Act, ask to speak with a complaint resolution official. Complaint resolution official, a CRO. Just think CRO. CRO is the airline's expert on disability accommodation issues. Airlines are required to have one available to you at no cost at each airport or by telephone at the times they are operating. If a violation is significant and the CRO can't resolve it, you can go back later and file an FAA complaint. And I strongly urge you to do that. And we can share that link with you too.
Well, thank you for sharing your expertise and your own personal experiences with us, Dr. Crawford. Let's continue answering a couple more questions from our viewers. We heard from Jorge, who tells us that he wants to get involved in advocating for improved air travel for people living with MS. So he heard your plea, and Jorge wants to know how he can get started.
Absolutely, Jorge. We need your help. We need your help right now. Join our MS Activist Network. I joined a decade ago. And very, very occasionally, you'll get an action alert from the MS Society asking you to act on a particular legislative item that's important to people living with MS. Don't worry, you won't get spammed. It isn't that frequent, but boy, does it matter. And we need everyone involved.
You heard from Phil, who's wondering if there are any other considerations that people living with MS should keep in mind to ensure a safe experience at the airport and in the air.
Yeah. Plan ahead. Plan ahead. Make sure you have everything that you need. Pack carefully. Make sure you don't forget anything important like your wheelchair charger or any medications that you need. Make sure that you have notes that you can carry with you. I usually print out my schedule so that I have a hard copy, just in case my device, I just can't get to my device at that moment. So I tend to print out my itinerary. That seems to be helpful to me.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted some great questions, and thank you, Dr. Crawford, for being with us today.
Sure.
Before we close, I want to share some of the resources that we talked about during today's program. You're all invited to join fellow MS activists and help make air travel more accessible for everyone. Be sure to visit the Society's website to learn more about MS activists and to find a whole variety of travel resources that could make your next trip a lot easier on you. And visit the U.S. Department of Transportation website to learn more about the Airline Passengers and Disabilities Bill of Rights, to find information to help you protect yourself while traveling, or to file a complaint. And I'll also remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please be sure to visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups. You'll hear about ways for you to get involved, and you'll find out about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Crawford for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Scott Crawford and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.